Welcome back to the show, everyone. It's time for another deep dive.
Yes.
And today's topic is leadership
Oh, cool.
in the digital age. And we've got some pretty
Ah,
fascinating research you sent me, actually,
really?
that focuses on a concept called Stigmergy leadership.
Okay.
You ever heard of that?
I have actually, yeah. It's a pretty interesting concept.
Yeah. So for those of us who maybe this is the first time we're hearing this term,
Right.
can you give us like a really quick explanation of what exactly Stigmergy leadership is?
Sure. So the term stigmergy actually comes from biology, and it was first used to describe how insects like ants and termites coordinate their actions without any central control. So imagine like a colony of ants building a complex nest.
Yeah.
There's no single ant that's like the architect or the foreman, right?
Right.
They all just kind of follow these simple rules based on the traces left behind by other ants. Like, if an ant finds a good source of food, it'll leave a pheromone trail. And then other ants will follow that trail and reinforce it. And over time, these individual actions, these traces, add up to create this really complex and coordinated behavior.
So it's kind of like a chain reaction.
Exactly. A chain reaction of individual actions, all guided by these traces left behind by others.
And you're saying this applies to leadership now, too.
That's where it gets really interesting. Researchers are now applying this concept of stigmergy to understand leadership in the digital age. So instead of pheromone trails, we have digital traces, likes, shares, comments, retweets, all these things that we do online.
So basically, every time we interact online, we're leaving these little digital breadcrumbs that can potentially influence others.
Exactly. It's like we're all contributing to this collective intelligence, this kind of digital hive mind
I like that.
that's shaping opinions and actions on a massive scale. And the research you sent actually dives into some amazing real-world examples of this.
Yeah, I was blown away by some of the case studies in there.
Right.
So just to give our listeners a little taste, we've got protests in Hong Kong and Belarus,
Yes.
the George Floyd protests, the COVID-19 pandemic, and even the military coup in Myanmar.
Mm-hmm.
All of these events were shaped in some way by this kind of Stigmergy leadership.
It's fascinating how this one concept can apply to such a diverse range of events, right?
Yeah. And it really makes you think about leadership in a whole new way.
Absolutely.
So before we dive into the case studies themselves,
Yeah.
can you give us like a really quick overview of what are the key characteristics of Stigmergy leadership? What sets it apart from the more traditional models of leadership that we're used to?
Sure. So there are three key characteristics that really define stigmergy leadership, and those are autonomy, reproducibility, and scalability.
Okay, break those down for us.
Right. So autonomy means that individuals are acting independently. They're not following orders from a central leader.
Got it.
Reproducibility means that the actions can be easily copied and replicated by others. So think about a viral tweet that sparks a protest. Anyone can retweet it, anyone can share it, and that's what allows it to spread so quickly. And then scalability means that the actions can grow and expand rapidly to include a large number of people. So it's not just limited to a small group.
So it has the potential to go viral, basically.
It has the potential to go viral, basically.
Exactly. It can scale up very quickly and reach a global audience.
So we're talking about a very different kind of leadership here. It's not about top-down control. It's more about this kind of bottom-up emergence of influence and action.
Exactly. It's a much more distributed form of leadership. Influence is coming from everywhere and anywhere.
Fascinating. Okay, I'm really eager to dive into some of these case studies and see how this all played out in the real world.
Me too.
Let's start with the 2019 protests in Hong Kong.
Okay.
I remember seeing those images of massive crowds and the really creative ways that protesters were using social media to organize and to kind of like evade authorities. It seemed like this really spontaneous, leaderless movement. But was it really? Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually a bit more complex than it might seem at first glance. While there wasn't a single figurehead directing the protests, social media definitely acted as this central nervous system, allowing individuals to coordinate actions,
Right.
share information, and really build a collective identity.
So it's more about the collective intelligence of the crowd rather than the directives of a single leader.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that the research shows how these digital traces of dissent actually built on a history of activism in Hong Kong, going all the way back to 1994.
Wow.
So it's like those past actions left a digital imprint that kind of fueled the 2019 protests.
So the seeds of the movement were planted long before those protests actually erupted.
Exactly. And it shows how these digital traces can persist over time and have a lasting impact.
That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. But was everyone just blindly following what they saw online?
Not at all. Social media actually allowed protesters to create and share independent political narratives.
Oh, okay.
They could bypass traditional media.
Which was often seen as being controlled by the government.
Exactly. So they were able to kind of take control of the narrative and
Right.
really shape public opinion. And they did some really creative things like organizing these massive choral singing events and citizen press conferences, all coordinated online.
So it was like this digital town square where people could debate, strategize, and take action.
It was, and it really empowered individuals to take ownership of the movement and contribute in their own unique ways, which is really what Stigmergy leadership is all about.
Right. It's not about waiting for someone to tell you what to do.
Right.
It's about taking initiative and acting on your own beliefs.
Absolutely. And that's what made the Hong Kong protests so powerful, was this groundswell of individual action.
Fueled by those digital traces.
Exactly.
Okay, so in this case, Stigmergy leadership seemed to be a force for good, enabling this decentralized movement to challenge authority. But what about situations where those digital traces are used for less noble purposes? I'm thinking about the military coup in Myanmar, where social media was used by both sides of the conflict.
Right.
How do we make sense of that?
Yeah, the situation in Myanmar really highlights the double-edged nature of Stigmergy leadership. So ironically, the military was actually an early adopter of Facebook in Myanmar. They were using it to spread propaganda and kind of consolidate their control.
Wow.
But then, when the coup happened, those same tools ended up being used against them.
Oh, wow. So it backfired on them.
It did. People started using Facebook and other platforms to organize protests, to document human rights abuses, and to rally international support. It was like a digital tug of war, with both sides trying to use those digital traces to their advantage.
So it becomes this battle for control of the narrative.
Exactly. And it shows how important it is to consider who controls the platforms
Right.
that we're using for activism. And it also highlights the need for digital literacy so that people can critically evaluate the information they're seeing online.
Right. Because it's not always clear who's behind those messages or what their agenda might be.
Absolutely. And the military's attempts to shut down the internet actually made things worse.
Oh, how so?
It caused economic damage and really alienated the population.
Yeah, it's hard to control information in a digitally connected world.
It is. And it shows how traditional power structures are kind of struggling to adapt to this new landscape.
It's like trying to put the genie back in the bottle.
Exactly. Once that information is out there, it's really hard to control it.
Right. Okay, so we've seen how Stigmergy leadership can be used for both good and bad.
We have.
It can empower people to challenge authority,
Yes.
but it can also be used to spread misinformation
Yeah.
and manipulate public opinion.
Yeah.
So it's this really powerful tool that needs to be used responsibly.
It does. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations about digital literacy and critical thinking.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to another global event that was deeply impacted by Stigmergy leadership,
Right.
the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm curious to see how these principles applied in a situation that wasn't about political protest or social movements.
Right, right. So even in a global health crisis, we saw these principles of Stigmergy leadership at play, and sometimes in really surprising ways.
Like what?
Well, for example, in China, individuals were using platforms like GitHub
GitHub.
to archive early news reports about COVID-19. They were trying to get around government censorship and make sure that this crucial information reached a global audience.
So they were leaving those digital traces, even in the face of potential consequences.
They were driven by this need to share information and to challenge the official narrative.
And those actions had a ripple effect around the world.
They did. It helped researchers and health officials understand the virus and its spread.
So those seemingly small acts of defiance actually had a huge impact on the global response to the pandemic.
They did. And it speaks to the power of individual action, even in the midst of a global crisis.
It's amazing how these digital breadcrumbs can lead to such significant outcomes.
It-
Okay, but it wasn't just individuals driving this information flow, right?
Right.
Didn't the Chinese government also play a role?
They did, and this is where it gets really interesting. Their decision to release the SARS-CoV-2 genome sequence
Oh, right.
was actually a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
Because it allowed scientists worldwide to rapidly develop diagnostic tests
Right.
and really accelerate research efforts.
So a single act of transparency from a traditional authority figure actually fueled this wave of decentralized collaborative action
Mhm.
that ultimately benefited the entire world.
It did, and it shows how traditional leadership and Stigmergy leadership can actually work together.
They can complement each other.
They can.
So it's not always an either situation.
It's not. It's more about understanding how these different forms of leadership can interact and influence each other.
Right. Okay, I'm starting to see how this whole concept of Stigmergy leadership
Mm-hmm.
is really changing the game when it comes to how we think about leadership in the digital age.
It is. It's a whole new way of thinking about power and influence.
Okay, we've still got a lot more to unpack here,
We do.
but I think it's time to take a break.
Okay.
We'll be back soon to discuss more of those fascinating case studies and to delve deeper into the implications of this new form of leadership for all of us.
Sounds good.
So we've seen how powerful this Stigmergy leadership can be,
Yes.
but I'm also thinking about some of the potential downsides,
Right.
What are some of the criticisms or concerns that people have raised about this kind of decentralized, leaderless approach?
Yeah. So one of the big criticisms is that it can be really hard to hold people accountable when there's no clear chain of command.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's like if something goes wrong,
Right.
who do you blame?
Right.
It's kind of like trying to herd cats.
Yeah.
Everyone's going in different directions, and it's hard to know who's responsible.
Right. And it makes me think about the whole issue of misinformation online.
Yes.
With Stigmergy leadership,
Right.
there's no one to kind of fact check things or to stop harmful content from spreading.
That's true. It's a real challenge.
So how do we deal with that?
Well, I think it requires a shift in our thinking.
Okay.
We can't just rely on those old top-down models
Right.
of control and censorship. We need to find new ways to foster critical thinking and media literacy.
So basically empower individuals to be more discerning about the information they're consuming and sharing?
Exactly. It's like giving everyone a compass and a map
Oh, I like that.
instead of trying to build walls around them.
Right. It's about giving people the tools they need to navigate this complex landscape on their own.
Exactly. And it also requires a shift in mindset for the platforms themselves.
Okay.
They need to move away from just amplifying whatever goes viral and start thinking more about promoting quality content, fostering constructive dialogue,
Right.
and creating spaces where diverse perspectives can be shared respectfully.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we need to create a healthier ecosystem for information online.
Absolutely. And it's going to take a lot of effort from everyone involved.
Yeah. It's a collective responsibility for sure.
It is. So we've talked about the challenges of accountability and misinformation, but I'm also wondering about the long-term potential of Stigmergy leadership.
Yeah, me too.
It seems great for mobilizing people quickly, responding to immediate crises,
Right.
but can it also be a driving force for lasting change?
Yeah. Can it really tackle those big systemic issues that require long-term commitment and planning?
That's the big question, and it's one that researchers are still trying to figure out.
Okay.
One of the limitations of Stigmergy leadership is that it tends to be very reactive.
Right.
Responding to events as they unfold, rather than proactively planning for the future.
Right. So it's more about putting out fires than preventing them.
Exactly, and that can be a problem when you're trying to address those complex long-term challenges.
Right. So like climate change
Yeah.
or systemic inequality.
Right.
These are issues that require a more strategic, organized approach.
They do, but I wouldn't say that Stigmergy leadership is incapable of driving long-term change.
Okay.
It's more about understanding its strengths and limitations and finding ways to kind of leverage those strengths while mitigating the weaknesses.
So maybe a hybrid approach is needed.
Exactly. Maybe we need to combine the agility and responsiveness of Stigmergy leadership
Right.
with the strategic planning and accountability of more traditional leadership models.
So like a best of both worlds kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good way to put it. And this is where those network facilitators or digital strategists that we
Right.
talked about earlier might come in.
Yeah, they could play a crucial role.
They could, because they can help to guide and coordinate these decentralized movements,
Right.
make sure they stay focused on their goals.
Yeah, like they're kind of like the shepherds of the digital flock,
I like that analogy.
guiding them in the right direction.
Yeah, without trying to control them too much.
Right.
Because that's the key, right?
Yeah.
You want to maintain that autonomy and that bottom-up energy, but But you also want to make sure that the movement is going somewhere.
Right, that it's actually making progress towards its goals.
Exactly. And that's where I think this whole field of digital leadership is really exciting.
Yeah.
Because it's all about experimenting and innovating.
Right.
Finding new ways to lead and follow in this rapidly changing world.
It's like we're all figuring this out together in real time.
We are. And that can be a little bit scary.
Yeah.
But it's also incredibly exciting.
It is. It's like we're writing the rule book as we go along.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to
Sure.
share our experiences,
Right.
learn from each other,
Yeah.
and to kind of figure out what works and what doesn't.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about the potential of Stigmergy leadership.
We have.
We've talked about some of the challenges.
Yes.
But there's one more big question that we need to address.
Okay.
And that's the ethical dimension of all of this.
Yeah.
You know, we've seen how these digital traces can be used for both good and bad.
We have.
How do we make sure that Stigmergy leadership is used for positive social change
Right.
and not for things like spreading harmful ideologies or undermining democratic institutions?
Yeah. That's a really crucial question. And it's one that we need to be thinking about very carefully.
Because the stakes are high.
They are.
These are powerful tools that we're talking
Yeah.
about. And they can be used for good or for evil.
They can. And because Stigmergy leadership is so decentralized and difficult to control,
Right.
it presents some unique challenges when it comes to establishing ethical boundaries.
So how do we even begin to address that?
Well, I think it starts with education.
Okay.
You know, we need to educate individuals about digital citizenship,
Right.
foster a culture of critical thinking and media literacy,
Yeah.
and develop mechanisms for holding each other accountable.
So it's kind of like we need a new social contract for the digital age.
Exactly. We need to figure out how to behave responsibly and ethically in these online spaces.
Yeah. It's a tall order, but it feels essential if we want to harness the power of Stigmergy leadership
It does.
for good, while also protecting ourselves from its potential downsides.
And it's a conversation that's just beginning.
Right.
You know, we're still in the early stages of understanding this whole phenomenon, and there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, it's a work in progress for sure.
It is. But it's an important conversation to have.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, I think this is a good place to pause for.
Okay.
We'll be back soon to continue this deep dive into Stigmergy leadership.
Sounds good.
So we've explored all these fascinating examples of Stigmergy leadership,
Yeah.
seen how it's played out in protests,
Right.
pandemics,
Uh-huh.
even military coups.
Yeah. It's amazing how this one concept can apply to so many different situations.
It is. And it's definitely made me rethink how I view leadership.
Me too.
But where do we go from here?
That's the big question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we actually apply this knowledge? How do we navigate this new world where leadership is so decentralized
Right.
and anyone with a smartphone can potentially spark a movement?
It's a really exciting time to be alive, that's for sure.
It is, but it's also a little bit overwhelming.
I agree.
Like, where do we even begin?
Well, I think it starts with understanding that leadership is not just about those at the top anymore.
Right.
It's not about giving orders or having all the answers. It's more about understanding how influence flows in these complex networks.
Okay.
How those digital traces we talked about can shape opinions and behaviors.
Right.
And how we can all participate in shaping the direction of these movements.
So it's like we're all leaders in a way.
In a way, yes. We all have the potential to influence others whether we realize it or not.
It's like we're all part of this giant web, and our actions, no matter how small, can have ripple effects that we may never fully comprehend.
Exactly. And that can be a really empowering thought.
It can. But it also comes with a lot of responsibility. It does. Because it means that we have to be mindful of the digital traces we're leaving behind.
Right, like what we're posting, what we're sharing.
Exactly. We have to think about the messages we're sending and the values we're promoting.
Because our online actions can have real-world consequences.
They can. And it's not enough to just go with the flow.
Right.
We have to be active, engaged citizens.
So we can't just sit back and let things happen.
We can't. We need to question assumptions,
Okay.
evaluate evidence,
Yeah.
seek out diverse perspectives.
And be willing to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. And I think this is where digital literacy becomes so important.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
It's about having the skills and knowledge to navigate this complex digital landscape effectively.
So it's not just about knowing how to use social media.
It's not. It's about understanding how algorithms work,
Yeah.
how to identify misinformation,
Right.
and how to use these platforms to connect with others, build communities, and advocate for the causes you care about.
So it's like a whole new set of skills that we need to learn.
It is, and it's something that we need to be teaching in schools, in workplaces, everywhere.
Right. It's not just for kids anymore.
Definitely not. We all need to be lifelong learners when it comes to digital literacy.
Because the landscape is constantly changing.
It is, and we need to be able to adapt and evolve along with it.
This is a lot to take in, but I'm also feeling really hopeful.
Me too.
Like we're on the verge of something really amazing.
I think we are.
We have the opportunity to create a more just and equitable world
Right.
where everyone has a voice.
Yeah, and where leadership is more distributed and more accessible.
It's exciting. So to sum it all up, what are some key takeaways that our listeners can apply to their own lives,
Okay.
regardless of whether they see themselves as leaders or followers?
All right, I'll give you 3.
Okay.
Number 1, be mindful of your digital footprint.
Okay, so think before you post.
Exactly. Every online action has the potential to influence others. So be intentional about the messages you're sending.
It's like the old saying, actions speak louder than words.
Right.
But in the digital age, our online actions are often the loudest words we speak.
I love that.
Okay, number 2.
Number 2, cultivate your critical thinking skills.
Okay.
Don't just passively consume information.
Right.
Question assumptions, evaluate evidence, and seek out diverse perspectives.
It's like being a detective, constantly gathering clues and trying to piece together the puzzle.
Exactly. Be skeptical, be curious, and don't be afraid to challenge the narratives that are presented to you.
Love it. Okay, and number 3.
Number 3, remember that leadership is not a position, it's a process.
Oh, I like that.
It's about taking initiative, inspiring others, and working collaboratively to create positive change.
So even if you don't have a fancy title or thousands of followers,
Right.
you can still be a leader in your own way.
Absolutely. Leadership is about impact, not about hierarchy.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
This has been an amazing deep dive into Stigmergy leadership.
I agree.
It's challenged our assumptions about leadership, inspired us to think differently about our own online actions, and given us hope that we can collectively shape a better future.
Couldn't said it better myself.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Likewise.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep those minds open and those digital traces positive.